for the purpose of recalling certain incidents important in our lives that has happened, that we want to get recorded down, written out in preparation for a book that we will publish in the future. This particular incident we want to talk about is the crash of the plane that eventually took the life of Mom, and eventually was the cause of Dad's death about 5 years later. Today is August the 18th. Sorry, August the 17th, 1979. And I'm going to turn the mic over to my older brother, Dee. We are gathered together at Yellowstone River camp area in the mountains in Utah for the family reunion. Now, Dee.
This is D. Packard. They've asked me to recall as much of the incidents as I can concerning the airplane accident and the activities that led to it. If I remember correctly, this was in 1957 in March. We had determined to go to Boise on some family business. There's Bill, my brother, myself, and my father and mother. Dad didn't want to go. He pulled against it consistently because he had a dream which he stated that we would indicated to him that he shouldn't go. We told him that there was nothing safer than flying, which was an overstatement. But anyway, Bill and I felt that there would be no problem going. But Dad had a premonition, an indication through this dream that he shouldn't go. But we talked him into going anyway. We took off, and everything was going fine until we got in the vicinity of Park Valley, when we attempted to evade a storm or some clouds, and the clouds were moving into the area, and eventually got close to the plane, and the plane started to ice up. We could see, Bill and I could see the ice forming on the leading edge of the wing. And I remarked to Bill that we were collecting ice. And we had to do something because the plane, we could see, was loading down with ice to the point where it wouldn't continue to fly. It was gradually settling down. When we saw that we were so heavily loaded with ice that it was not going to fly any further, we took steps to effect a landing some way or another. And we had Mom and Dad take their teeth out. I turned the ignition when it got down close to the what we thought was going to set down. And we turned the keys off to minimize any gasoline or fire damage. And we braced ourselves. We made sure that the Mom and Dad, who were in the back seat, had their seat belts cinched up good. And finally, then at the last minute, we attempted to pull the plane up into a stall to kill whatever forward speed we could. And as a result, the plane and I misjudged the height at that point and settled and dropped about 40, 50 feet in a direct stall, but we had no forward speed. It was straight, just down. And as a result of that, Bill hurt his back. I hurt mine, but Bill broke his. Dad hit his head against the seat in front of him and cut it quite severely, and broke his jaw because hitting his head that hard against the front seat. Mom had braced herself and had put her foot under, some way or another, got it underneath the front seat. And the front seat, when it come down with the weight of the person that was in it, it broke her ankle. And that was essentially the only damage that that Mother had that we had noticed at all.
Did she have lung?
She may have had a broken rib, but I doubt it. It was pneumonia that she contacted before. But after the plane, we got out of the plane. Bill got out, and I both got out. But Bill complained about his back, and it got severe quickly. And he showed me, and I could see a red welt right over his backbone, gradually getting redder and bluer. And so I helped him back in the plane. And Mom and Dad, Mom was conscious all the time. Dad was knocked out and was mumbling to himself, but he was unconscious, essentially from the blow on his head. I determined we had to go for help. It started storming just briefly, just sort of showers of snow showers. There was about 1.5 inches, 2 inches of snow on the ground. We couldn't see any habitation anywhere around. So, but I determined we had to go for help because we couldn't stay there until they found us. We had filed a flight plan so that they would start looking for us, and I knew after so much time had passed that we hadn't arrived at our destination. But I knew that we couldn't wait that much longer. So anyway, I started down to tell help. Mom didn't want me to go. She kept coaxing me not to go. And so we bundled them up in blankets the best we could in the cabin of the plane. And then I started down the mountain, side of the mountain. We'd landed on a sort of a plateau. And then I went back. I decided that I ought to go back and again, because I was a little bit confused. And I took the compass, tore the compass out of the dash of the plane, and took a set of binoculars that I had in the plane with me. And Mom still coaxed me not to go, but Bill and I discussed this, and we decided that one of us had to go for help. So I started down the mountain using the field glasses, trying to find where I was going. My back hurt, but I knew we had to hurry. And finally, I kept walking and walking and walking, and the storm was just on and off. And off in the distance, way off in the distance, I could see a clump of trees, but I couldn't see any buildings whatsoever until I'd got within I kept heading for those trees, and when I got close, within less than a mile, I could see that there was some buildings there. And when I went in, evidently I was pretty well covered with blood. And Chet Kunzler, his father, and Daryl, were out in the yard working in the yard, in the field, or in the yard on some equipment, I think. And anyway, they saw that, they thought that I was drunk. They saw me walking down the road. But anyway, when it got closer, they could see that there was some problems. And then I told them that I was involved in an airplane accident. And I'd pointed out roughly where it was. Well, we went and got in the Jeep. They put some straw in the Jeep and some other equipment, some rope and the different things like that. And we all took off. And it measured 13 miles back to the site, and we could get the Jeep practically to it. And
what was interesting is that was the only Jeep in that whole valley that would have got up there.
It was just a sort of a trail, and it was muddy when we got up close. It was muddy and snowy on the ground, so there's only way to get there. Well, my thoughts as I went there was I was very much concerned whether they would be alive. I didn't know how much time had passed. I had a watch on, but it had been, in the accident, the dash had been smashed in at 8 o'clock that morning. By the way, I still have that watch. And and it was about 1 o'clock at the time I got to the farm. So, I wasn't sure of the condition, but when I got closer, I could hear Bob or Bill and Mother talking. when I got close to the plane, and the relief that come over me was tremendous because I knew they were still alive. And yes, Dad was still unconscious. Anyway, we loaded them in, and by that time, things are very hazy from then on for me. I couldn't remember very much that went on, except that I was extremely tired and from the events, because it was, by the time we got the people out of the plane and down to the ranch, it was nearly dark. And then I remember riding with the sheriff to Tremonton, and the folks, after we got them all to a store, the Carter store in
The doctor and the nurse were visiting.
and yes, that's right. And they took care of them at the store in Park Valley, took some emergency care for them, and put them on I guess they had sedated some of them. Mother never did. But I remember this one thing. At that time, when they were putting Mom and taking her into the store, my mother, I kept telling her, everything is going to be all right. She says, no, Dee, this is my time to go. And yet I felt all the time that she was the least hurt of the bunch, except for myself, that there was very little evidence of injury to her. But evidently, she had contracted pneumonia from the exposure in the plane. And she may have, and probably lung damage. But none of this was apparent at the time, but she knew that her time had come.
I'll give this now to my sister Barbara, who was very close to this entire incident.
My name is Barbara. It just happened that the ranch that Dee walked to was my in-laws' ranch, and it was their family that carried their bodies from the airplane. Pardon? Yeah, my in-laws to be. And my brother-in-law, who was single at the time, was one of the fellows, along with his brother Chet, who were standing on the haystack. And when they saw Dee walking down their lane, one said to the other, "Hey, look, there's a drunk man coming down the lane." And the other says, "No," and he says, "That's..." And as he drew near, they could see that Dee was having serious complications, and he was nearly staggering on the ground, and almost it was a very awkward walk. And as he drew near, they could see blood all over his face, and they jumped down and ran to help him, and they took Dee into the house. I don't know if Dee would remember this or not, but Jay's mother my husband's mother did not want Dee to go up on the mountain. They begged and begged him to stay, and he refused because he was afraid that they wouldn't be able to locate the airplane location. And since then, my husband's family had revealed that they had just bought that Jeep pickup truck just the week prior to the airplane crash, or they would not have even reached the distance that they did up on the mountain. But what was really interesting to me is my brother-in-law Darrell wrote a research paper for Utah State University when he was going to school, and his theme was "To the Rescue," and he was the number one individual that carried those bodies out of the airplane, and he, pardon?
There were people, weren't bodies yet.
Yeah. Well, they were people, and he expressed in this paper the feelings that he had every step he took down that mountain. He said, "I particularly recall your mother." He said, "My every step I took, she would cry and groan, and she gave the impression that she was in tremendous pain. Well, since then, we learned that one side of her rib cage was crushed, and that's probably what was causing her so much pain. Plus, her leg was just shattered, and you could not see any formation of the leg after she had been to the hospital. Another interesting point was Daryl commented, he says, when I was carrying those people down that mountain, he says, and it was a steep mountain, every step, he says, I realized in that snow that if I would have slipped, it would have meant the life of that person. And he said that they had made stretchers out of the cedars and used their coats to lay the bodies on the stretchers. And he says that's the best that we could do. And then they laid them in the back of their Jeep. And then they took them down to the store. Well, in the meanwhile, Carter store. And incidentally, all those Carters are our relatives, very close. All those people out there that gave aid to our family are relatives through Dominicus Carter. They married their children through one of Dominicus's wives. And no, that was Hamer Reiser. And Brother Carter, that owns the store and the hotel out there, had 7 or 8 children, and one of his son-in-laws was visiting that weekend, and it's Dr. Hamer Reiser, and his wife was a nurse, and they were both there, and they had their medical kit with them, and they gave medical aid to each one of the members of our family. And when Jay and I, my husband and I, go to church out there, quite often one will comment, I was the one that rubbed your mother's legs. I was the one that wiped off your mother's brow. Or it was just very interesting to me that they played such a big part in the lives of our family. Another thing that I recall is I'd like to tell my personal experience. Mom left a note on the table just when they left to go on this airplane trip. Barbara, I was 15. She says, Barbara, remember not to let Mark outside. He had been sick. And I saved that writing from Mom. Those were the last written words that Mom had given to me. Well, in the afternoon, I took the radio, the family radio, into my bedroom and turned it on, and I laid down to sleep. And I recall on the news, it came over the news, that there was an accident, an airplane crash, or a missing airplane from Bountiful going to Boise. And all the information I could identify with except the color of the plane. They made a mistake. I knew, now whether it was red or yellow, but they gave the opposite color of what the plane really was. What color was it, Dee?
Yellow.
It was yellow, and they said the plane must have been red. And I thought, oh, I can remember in my sleep, I'm relieved, because that's not the color of Dee's airplane, and I felt so good. And then about 20 minutes, a half hour later, it came over again, and I remember waking up and jumping up on the bed, and it announced on the news that a D. Packard from Bountiful, Utah was the pilot. And I jumped out of bed, and I ran over to Dee's house, and Janet was crying, and I was crying, and Janet made some comments about her feelings towards the airplane crash. And we listened all day long to hear the report. And then the next report that was of a change, we received that that someone from the airplane had arrived to a ranch to receive help. And then the next thing that I recall that made an impression in my life is I went to the Tremont Hospital to see the members of our family, and Dad was unconscious, and Dee was not there at the time, and Bill, I believe you were in a hospital in Salt Lake at the time, weren't you?
He was there.
Were you in Tremont there?
Approximately how far is the Tremont Hospital from the scene of the accident?
An hour, about an hour and a half.
The closest hospital is.
Oh, it's more than that.
Yeah, 1:45.
Yeah, see, because there's Brigham in between Tremont, and it's a good hour drive.
Not Brigham. No, not Brigham. You go right straight to
Is-
Snowfield, right to Fremont.
Oh, that's right, Tremont's before Brigham. Okay, and I went up to the hospital to see the members of the family, and I recall a lot of the members of the family being around, the different members of our family, and feeling bad, and we were staying in the motel directly across the street from that hospital, you remember? And Mom was having a very difficult time with speech, very slow, and it seemed like we took turns going up into her room, because I can remember somebody came to me and says, now you can go up and see Mom and Dad. So I went up, and I recall Mom saying to me, and it took her so long to say it, Barbara, you be a good girl. And then she died the next day. But that statement made a great impression on my mind. In fact, I can remember when I used to do things in my teenage years, and I'd have problems and struggles, that I would reflect back onto that statement that Mom gave me, and it carried me through a lot. But the Kunzler family feel a great affection towards our family.
That's the rescue family.
And those are my in-laws. They really feel a deep love, especially for Bill and Dee, because of the love that they came back and showed to their family for what they had done. But Chet has a very deep feeling for what he had done.
Now, this is Bill. I'm going to back up to the time of the flight a little bit and reflect a little more on some of the things that Dee mentioned. There's some things that I observed that he may not have, and some feelings that went through my mind as we knew we were in trouble. The folks in the back seat seemed to be quite calm. They didn't utter a word. They knew we were in trouble and were doing the best we could. This happened to be an airplane with twin controls. There were sticks instead of a wheel. And I remember we were flying in fog. The plane had dropped down because of the heavy ice on the wings and dropped into the fog, and we couldn't see where we were going. We knew we were in mountainous area. And all at once the plane started to shake, and I saw the speedometer and brought the speed of the plane to Dee's attention, and he noticed that we were doing 170 miles an hour, and that little Piper Clipper didn't have the ability to go that speed. And then we knew that we were going down, and Dee pulled back on the stick just before we were to hit the ground, and I recall looking out the window, and I was afraid the tail of the plane as the plane was pulling up was going to hit the ground, and I remember seeing the sagebrush shake from the wind that the plane caused. We were that close to the ground. And we pulled back up into the fog, and that's when Dee said, well, Bill, while we're still thinking right, we've got to land the plane. And we were back in the fog. We didn't know where we were going, and for some reason the Lord directed us to a small plateau for the stall in. And I think Dee done a tremendous job installing that plane in. It's what saved some of our lives. I recall reading the newspaper, pilot conquers death, and that's just what he did. But some of the things that I remember following the wreck, I remember trying to get out of the doors of the plane, and the doors were jammed, but the windshield had broken out, and Dee instructed us that we'd have to climb out the windshield and then down the wings. And I remember of hearing that instruction, and that's the last thing I remembered. But he said that I, along with him, crawled out of the windshield of the plane and down the wing, and he was going up to the crest of the hill where there was a fence line going across the top of the mountain. He was going to see if that fence line led anywhere, and I was walking another direction. And then's when he went and heard me crying out, and I was undoubtedly face down in the snow, and he come down and helped me back. But anyway, Dee was come to give me first aid and help me back into the plane. Now, before I go through the some of the things that took place while Dee went for help, let me back up a little bit further and into our to the Packard home in Bountiful prior to going on the flight. Dee took every steps to make sure that things were in proper condition, weather-wise and every otherwise, to take the flight. The flight control said that the weather was okay as long as we stayed above or below 10,000 feet,
6,500.
or 6,500 feet, and of which we did. We thought we were okay, but it wasn't the case. We learned that even at that higher altitude, our wings were getting heavy with the moisture and ice. Dee mentioned that Dad had a dream that we shouldn't go on the flight. That in his dream he saw some distinct things that actually took place from the crash. He saw Dee with his cut face and so on, and he was very explicit in us not going on the flight. And I remember it was an argument between Mom and Dad about going on the flight. Mom was determined to go, and Dad was greatly concerned about going because he kept reflecting back on his dream. Well, Mom won, as you probably know. She always did, and we went on the flight. Well, anyway, back to the plane. In the plane, I recall that Dee handed me 3 candy bars, and they were all Milky Way bars, and there were some oranges and so on. Following the crash, right at the crash, I was the first one to come to. I looked myself over. I was bleeding out the nose and out the mouth, and I looked myself over, and I was real grateful that I felt all right. I thought I was okay. And I reached over, and Dee, I could see that he was hurt pretty bad in the face. Later on, it took 52 stitches to stitch up his face. But I reached over and just touched him, and he jumped up just like he woke up from a sleep, and and says, "Where are we? Is everything okay?" And I assured him that everything seems to be all right, that the folks are breathing. We turned around and we looked at Mom, and Mom looked the worst of them all. From her hitting the back of our seats with her head, it actually scalped her from the forehead back to the center of her head, pulling her scalp back. We were unaware of how serious she was hurt inside until after Did left, and I undoubtedly kept passing out off and on, but each time I'd come to, and then I'd talk with Mom a little bit, and she would say usually the same things each time. She'd say, "Bill, where's Dee?" As if she had forgotten that Dee did go for help. And I'd repeat it, and I'd tell her, "Yeah, Dee went for help." And she'd say, "Bill, let's pray for him." And I remember the number of short prayers we had up there in that plane in behalf of Dee, so that he would get to help okay. Dad, all of this time, was unconscious, and his breathing was hard because of the broken jaw and a broken nose. There was a little thin bone sticking out of his nose that all the time he was in the plane, blood was dripping off of that bone, and that bothered me probably as much as anything else, because I couldn't stop the bleeding. Mom pled for me to do what I could to get the plane in a condition that the weather, the snow started coming in, the windshield, and it was blowing right through, and she wanted to see if we could secure the plane so that the weather would stay out. And it was cold, and the snow was blowing on us. I had as much as an inch of snow on me, and they had the same in the back seat. And very often Mom would fall asleep, and then she would come to, and Mom and Dad, I'd heard that people would freeze to death when they fell asleep, and I had that big concern because it was very cold. The oranges that were left there and some radishes, I recall, were frozen solid. I couldn't use them. We did eat the candy bars. I remember on one candy bar that I ate that it made me sick, and I threw up in the front seat, and because of the
Turn it off for a minute.
okay, but Mom and Dad would fall asleep quite often. But prior to this, when Mom encouraged me to secure the plane from the weather, I remembered and knew that my back and my injuries were still somewhat numb. And so while they were that way, I recall of getting up on my hands and knees, and I felt like I had a ton of weight on my back, but I still crawled out onto the hood of the plane and got a piece of glass that was still sitting on the hood, and brought it back in and secured it to one of the side windows, and then took a blanket and tucked the blanket up in the visors and then down. And the wind was blowing so hard, I remember the puff of the blanket trying to push in the plane, and the only thing I could find to hold it was to lay on my side and lay my knees against the dash of the plane with the blanket between to hold it secure. I tucked a map in the other window. We had some magazines and some maps there, and I read of how people go to sleep and freeze to death. I was concerned about the folks, and so when they went to sleep, I rolled up a map, and periodically I would reach back and and hit each one of them to keep them groaning, and I'd wake Mom back up. Dad never did come to while I was there to talk to, but his breathing was difficult. He kind of snored as he breathed up there. And but but each time I would hit Mom, she would always think of Dee. She was always wondering where Dee was at, and then when I'd tell her, she'd always say, "Well, let's pray for him." Well, she
Did you?
and we prayed every time. We prayed for Dee. I was obedient, and sometimes she would offer the prayer, and sometimes I would offer the prayer. And in the process, while we were praying, we'd always remember Dad also. We knew that Dad was seriously hurt beside us. Well, during the process of that day, as the day went on, we were always thinking of Dee and wondering if he had found some place to help us get off the mountain. I began to get the feeling back into my back, and the pain started to come back, and I remember of trying to put myself in a comfortable position on my side or on my stomach, and the only comfortable position I could find was on my left side with my knees up against the dashboard. I remember of trying to turn over, and I turned clear over to the other side, only to find that it was the most uncomfortable position and had to turn all the way back. And I recall that it took not seconds, but it took minutes to make a turn, and the pain. And then I was concerned about my right leg, my right foot. I didn't have any feeling in it, and I thought that it was freezing. And I become a little concerned about myself and my own condition. And I called back to Mom and asked her if she could lean forward and rub my foot if I leaned it over the back seat. And she cooperated and leaned forward just got to my foot and touched it. And then she let out a scream and passed out. And then I knew that there was something else seriously wrong with her. And she, but when she come to again, she remembered it. And she says, "Bill, is there any way you can get back here where we can all be together and keep warm?" And I remember getting as far as up to the top of the back seat, and looking over, and knew that if I went over, I would just topple right down on them, and I'd probably injure myself, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't get to them, and I was continually concerned about my right leg because I had no feeling, and I thought it was frozen. Mom even raised up another time, just enough to pull my shoe off. She pulled it off, let out another scream, passed out, and my shoe fell down behind the seat, and there I was without protection for my foot now. And I knew for sure it was going to freeze. But anyway, I recall as time went on in the late afternoon, we all got very sleepy, and then I got a little sloppy about reaching back and talking to the folks and so on. I let them sleep, and I got sleepy myself. And while we were there sleeping, I all at once thought I heard something down the hill, the sound of a motor, I had driven a Jeep before and knew what the engine sounded like, and that's what I called it. I all at once become excited, and I says, woke up Mom, and I says, Mom, can you hear that Jeep? And she says, yes, Bill, I think I can. And as it got closer, then I knew it was, and then I really become excited. And I could tell that it was stuck, that it was trying to get closer to us, but the sound still made the same distance. And then all at once it turned off. And, I might mention that all the time we were up there for that day, I myself had no feeling in my glands and my bladder and so on, and I hadn't wet my pants for a long time, but I sure did it that day. I had no control, and you might be interested to note that for a number of months, and even as much as 2 years after, there was very little control. And through some therapy and so on, I was able to get some feeling back. But I recall Dee, even as sore as he was and as badly hurt as he was the first one to the top of the mountain. He beat the big Kunstler boys to the top, and they'd commented to me before that when he got that Jeep there, Dee wasn't going to wait for anybody. He was concerned about you and the airplane, and he was the first one to the top. And he stuck his head in the window, and he said, the first thing he says, Bill? And I says, yes, Dee. And he says, thank God, you're all okay. Well, they started taking us out of the plane one at a time. They took me out of the plane first and laid me beside the plane. And then they brought Mom out, and I remember of hearing Mom scream and yelling as they were pulling her out of the plane. And they laid her right beside me, and I looked down at her, and I remember seeing her, it was her left ankle, I believe it was her left ankle, was bent at a right angle. And I brought it to Dee's attention, and I says, Dee, look at Mom's leg. And he says, yeah, Bill, it's been crushed. And then I remember the rough trip down that mountain on that stretcher. First they took Dad, and I didn't think Dad had any scream in him because he was out. But on the way down that mountain, he did scream and yell, and because he was in some pain. And I remember hearing him all the way down the mountain. And then they took Mom down, and they left me up there. They took me down last. Then they left to the Jeep.
Not down the mountain.
Down to the Jeep.
They could not get the Jeep all the way to the plane.
They got the Jeep within a half a mile from the plane. Within a half a mile from the plane. I'll make a correction there. They got the Jeep within a couple of 100 yards from the plane. This particular Jeep had a winch, and they would tie the winch to these cedars. And Chet was telling me later that they were so anxious to get that Jeep up as close to that plane as possible because of the steep cliff embankment that they had to bring us down, that they were actually pulling cedars out of the ground. 6 and 8 inch cedars out of the ground trying to bring that Jeep closer. Well, I specifically remember them bringing Mom down out of the mountain, and the cries and the yells and screams that she made, and knowing that she was in terrific pain. Well, they laid us, the Kunstlers came prepared to take us down. They came with blankets over some straw. They were preparing to take some straw out to their cattle, to bed the cattle down when Dee got there, but they just took a few of the bales and broke them into the broke them into the back of the Jeep, spread the straw around, and Mother Kunzler got some blankets, threw them in the back, and they just took off. Dee didn't even want to wait for first aid there. He was just anxious to get back to us, and he demanded that we go right back. Well, the ride in the Jeep on the way down, they happened to lay Dad right next to me with his face about 2 inches from my face. And I remember I couldn't move, and Dad couldn't move, and I was breathing his breath, and I remember that very clearly, that his breath wasn't always all that sweet at that time. But I recall the rough ride in the Jeep all the way into the Carter Ranch.
Carter store.
And it was a real rough ride over the rocks and over the rough roads and the washboard. But when we got into the Carter store,
Could we stop there?
backing up just a little bit, I wanted understood that the Jeep was a Jeep pickup. It was an old model Jeep pickup.
No, brand new.
I'll take that back. It was a brand new one. I didn't have time to take a look to see if it was new or old. But anyway, we thank the Lord for it. It took us off the mountain. It was sliding down the mountain because it was so steep. Well, anyway, we got to the Carter store, and there were 2 highway patrolmen there that just happened to be members of the church. And I remember Dee and these 2 highway patrolmen.
They were waiting there.
They were waiting, and they laid their hands on my head and administered to me just as soon as I got there. I remember they had some hot chocolate for us, and I remember I drank a cup of hot chocolate, and it just got to my stomach long enough to come back up, and I threw up all over the floor. I remember one of the nurses. There were 2 ladies there, and one of them was a nurse that were taking care of us. And I remember this doctor, Dr. Hamer Reiser, was concerned about my right leg and my right foot, that I had no feeling, and these two ladies were massaging it and working my foot to try to get feeling back into it, and there was some great concern about the color. They said that it was blue, and the doctor knew it was frozen. But I recall them bringing hot towels that had just come out of boiling water and laying across my foot. Later on, my foot peeled from the heat from the hot towels, but it brought some sensation back into it. Going a little further, they took us later on into Tremont. I want to, first of all, let you know that the Carters and those that took care of us there at the ranch many of them weren't trained people for situations like this, but they took things in their own hands and done an excellent job in caring for us all. Later on, an ambulance for some reason, it was towards the latter part of the day. She was concerned about her own condition. She says, "Bill, I'm worried about Barbara and Mark." She says, "Would you see that Beth takes care of Mark, and then would you and Joanne take care of Barbara?" And I remembered telling her that we would. She knew, I guess, that I was okay, and I assured her that they'd be taken care of if anything happened. Okay, now back to back to the ambulance. They took us into Tremont, and the doctor that cared for us there at the Tremont Hospital happened to be a stake president also, a very humble, good man. And he admitted that my condition was something that he couldn't handle, that he didn't have the facilities there to handle my condition, but he could take care of the folks. And then from there, they transferred me to the Fort Douglas Hospital in Salt Lake. And again, I remember the ambulance drive there. I remember it was a beautiful green Cadillac as they was bringing me out. I remember that. But going over those cement roads past Bountiful and on to Salt Lake, every rut I felt. And
that same day?
No, this was a couple days later.
You don't know exactly.
I don't. It was a couple days later. I do remember in the hospital that there was a time there I had a hard time breathing for some reason, and they never gave us any water. We sucked on ice, but I had a hard time breathing once, and I didn't want anybody to touch me. But anyway, I ended out in the Fort Douglas Hospital, and the doctor that took care of me there was a Dr. Bach. He just frankly told me that I don't have to worry about my condition, that he has handled several that are just like mine, but to be prepared to be laid up for at least 17 months. And immediately I didn't want to be laid up for that long. I figured that there was more important things for me to do, and so through my wife I contacted my elders quorum president and the bishop. They come in and administered to me. Well, anyway, there was, after 2 weeks of laying on my back, they performed an operation. They found that my back had been broken and had collapsed, chipping 5 vertebrae as my back broke and slipped up. And they operated on me. Prior to this, I was paralyzed. I remember the doctor gave me a shot, and he thought that I was out. And he was instructing my wife to be prepared to take care of me in a wheelchair. And I remember of hearing that. And I made up my mind that that wasn't going to be the case. And when I come out of the operation, there the doctors were with some pins to stick my legs to see if I had feeling, and I did, and I didn't feel too good about them sticking me with pins. But everything worked out all right. I was administered to 4 times. The first time, the doctor said I'd be laid up for 17 months. The second time that I was administered to, it was cut it down to 12 months, and then to 9 months. And then I was out of the hospital in 4 months from the blessings of the priesthood.
Fused your vertebrae?
They took a piece out of my hip, a piece of bone from my hip bone, and placed it in my back, and fused it. The Dr. Bach explained to me the break. He said your back was broke and the spinal cord had been pinched shut, and that's why I didn't have any feeling in my lower part of my body. And he said the spinal cord was actually pinched shut,
But not sad.
but it wasn't cut. And he says we just took a hold of the muscles and pulled them apart, brought it back together, and he says we fused the broken vertebrae and the broken part, and he assured me that I would have a much better back for strength than I had before, and with less flexibility. And of course, I've had to go back to the chiropractor several times because when I swing a bat playing ball, it'll pop that bottom part of my back right out of place, and because it doesn't twist. And but I'm very fortunate. I still don't have all the feeling in my right leg. When I go on hiking with fishing and so forth, I'll get to the point that I'll even drag it a little bit.
But you can outfish any member of the family.
That's right. But we're all very fortunate, and the Lord has truly blessed us. And now I'll turn it back to Jay. Let me go. This is Bill again. Let me go back to the time I was in the Fort Douglas Hospital healing. Dr. Bach knew that my condition was too serious to inform me of some of the things that took place with the other members of the family that were in the airplane wreck. Unbeknownst to me, my mother had passed away just 3 days after she was brought down off the mountain. And I was, and Dr. Bach instructed my brothers and my wife and the members of the family not to inform me of this until I was physically ready to accept it. And it was 2 weeks before I was informed. But each time they'd come in and visit with me, I'd always ask, "How is Mom?" And everybody would say, "She's just fine." And she's just fine. And I was real pleased to hear that she was fine, and I knew that I would be able to see her again. And I'd always say, "How is Dad?" And Dad's okay also. He's got a broken jaw, and they would inform me of some of the problems with Dad, but they'd always just say, "Mom's just fine." Well, after 2 weeks had passed, they'd put a little bit of pressure on the doctor about telling me of the death of Mom, and Joanne was concerned that maybe other members of the family would spill it before she had the opportunity, and so she told me one day with the presence of some of the members of the family, and I remember the effect that it had on me. How I thought that Mom was okay all this time and that I would get to see her again, and as time went on, after they informed me, I recall that I didn't even get to go to the funeral or anything, and I began to ask a lot of questions about the funeral. And I remember one thing that Joanne said that I guess I'll never in my life forget, and I've mentioned it before as I've talked in sermons and so forth in my church positions. She says, "Bill," she says, "I've got to tell you one thing that happened at the funeral." That she said, here we had the funeral, and all the brothers and the sisters, your brothers and sisters, were around her casket, and they were getting ready to close the casket. And your brother Jay says, "Wait." And before this time, Jay, I guess, wasn't too good of a boy, and he knew it. And, sometimes it takes shake-ups and deaths of people and so forth to change people. And Jay says, "Wait, before you close the casket, let me have one more look." And so she says that Jay walks up to the casket and begins to talk to Mom's body and begins to plead with her and says, "Mom, you've worked all your life to try to make something out of me. You've come down to my home. You've done all you can to try to get me to be the kind of boy that you'd be proud of. And I feel that I failed you. But I will promise you that I can make something out of my life, and that I can change. And make my life worthwhile. And my wife, Joanne, said that he turned and walked away, and her casket was closed. But as I reflect back on the death of my mother and her patriarchal blessing, as we read her patriarchal blessing, the things that she had been promised and the things she had done were all fulfilled. And that Dad's wasn't. Dad's patriarchal blessing stated that he would live to see all of his sons go through the temple. And this blessing came true. Pertaining to a special blessing that Dad received under the hands of the priesthood prior to him going to Wake Island, in that blessing it stated that he would live to see all of his sons go through the temple. I must insert this. Here Dad had had the airplane accident, and we all thought that Dad would be the one that would probably go and not Mom, and it was the other way around. Dad was partially paralyzed. He wasn't well. His kidneys weren't functioning properly, but he still lived. We still couldn't understand why, except for that one part of his blessing, of the special blessing they'd received. We were having a stake temple appointment, and Joanne and I decided to go down early, a day early. And here Dad was probably in his worst condition in a home there in Nampa, a nursing home. And we went down to the temple, and on that Friday night session, Joanne and I, we ask. This is the Idaho Falls Temple, by the way. We always ask at the desk, do you have any names under the Bennett, Packard, or D. Packard line for Forrest Packard? And they looked through the files, and there were no names. But the next clerk, she overheard the name, and she reached up on a file in back of her, and got a card off the top of the file, and said, I overheard the name Packard. Would this name interest you? And I took it and read it, and it said Marquis Packard. Now, here Mark had been killed from a train wreck, and Dad was still living, and he was my brother. Mark was my brother, and so I thought, well, I might as well take it, and I'll go through the temple for him. She asked me if I'd want to go through for him, and I agreed I would. And I told Joanne of the experience, and we cornered one of the temple presidency following and explained the whole thing to them, how that happened. And they said many things like that happen here. But I recall going through the temple for him, and being ordained an elder for him, and taking out his endowments for him. And it was interesting that Dad died just within the next week after that. But that portion of his blessing that blessing was fulfilled, and then we could see that Dad's blessings and all of the promises that were given to him had been fulfilled, and he was ready to go.
This is D. Packard again. I'd like to reflect back on some of the incidents and the feelings, the thoughts and such. I specifically remember after I left the plane the second time to go for help, and as I come around the point of the mountain beside the plateau where I could see into the valley, the Park Valley itself, I surveyed as best I could over the valley. I'd been injured in one eye, so I could only see out of the other eye, and trying to use the binoculars in that condition was just a little bit difficult. But as I looked over the valley and trying to find some houses or habitation or evidence, I couldn't see anything. And I've often thought since the things that prompted me to go the direction I did, as I just cut off through the sagebrush, because it seemed like the road that was available there, it wasn't a road, it was just trail. It wasn't going in the right direction. So I just cut right through the sagebrush, and as I saw a clump of trees way off in the distance, miles away. And so I went to those set of trees, and there were other trees over probably towards Park Valley itself, the town. But I couldn't see anything in that direction, just too far. And as I got closer and closer, I could see these trees, but I couldn't see any housing at all until I come to a pond and saw some geese in this pond. Then I knew that somebody must be close. And as I rounded the ends there, then hidden in the trees, I could see the house. Then I felt that I had arrived. And the things that, as my back was, I had to run, and I run and walked, and then I'd run and walked during this time because I was under such urgency to get there. Then going up past, they took us into the store and laid Mom and Dad out, and Bob. I could walk, Bill. I could walk a little bit, and they kept wanting me to sit down or lay down, but I was so concerned about everything, and I couldn't let go. But they didn't take me in the ambulance to Tremont because there wasn't room, and so I rode in with the sheriff. And I thought at the time, I was just concerned about the folks. But when we arrived at Tremont, the thing that impressed me probably as much as anything about the whole incident was when I walked through the door of the hospital. I saw my bishop. The bishopric was there. My quorum presidency was there.
We need your testimony of this.
At this time, I felt so alone. My parents very seriously injured, and a brother whom I thought dearly of, so seriously injured. I was injured, but I could get around, could think about these things. And I was so alone, and I felt so responsible. In the priesthood, as I walked through that door and saw my priesthood brethren there, how grateful I was for the church. And I've thought many times since, that's really what it's all about. These brethren in the priesthood, my bishopric, were there to help me. And I thought, when they took me to the hospital, after that, Dr. Hicken, who was a member of our stake president, was my personal physician, and how he took steps to take care of me. But I'll never forget that he had probably thought there might be thoughts in my mind because of the sense of responsibility that were going through my mind, he took all the steps he could to prevent me from doing injury to myself. And I've thought of that a lot of times since. I had no such thoughts. But anyway, he took what he could. I was cut across the face. My nose was lifted right off my face and cut up one side. I still have scars there, and it makes a smile sometimes looks like a sneer. But nevertheless, I feel grateful for having come out of it as well as I did. And I've reflected back on this many times, that the Lord has purposes in all of these things that have major impact upon us. That these things don't happen by chance. But there's a divine purpose behind it all. And the Lord calls us when the time comes for us to go. And when our time is up and when we have accomplished all that we should have accomplished, and if we have kept the commandments, then he calls us home. And not until then. And generally, and as I reflect back on to some of the incidents that have taken place since, family ties that have been developed, family relationships, and feelings and friendships, and all that have been brought about, I feel that there has been a purpose in all of this. And I bear my testimony to the fact that there is a kind and loving Heavenly Father watching over all of us.
This is Bob. At the time the accident happened, I had been in the mission field for 6 months. And I had been in the mission field 6 months, serving in the Central Atlantic States, with headquarters in Roanoke, Virginia. And I received a phone call from Dee on the wee hours of Tuesday morning. I understand the accident happened Saturday, and that she died on Monday. And the family didn't want to bother my work that I was doing in the mission field, and therefore didn't contact me until that time. And if I remember correctly, Dee had called the mission home in Roanoke, and they in turn called me and asked me to call home, and it was in the early hours of the morning. And it was just 3 days prior to that I had become senior companion, been given a new missionary who was a very difficult missionary to handle, and eventually he left the mission field and came home with a dishonorable release because of his lack of cooperation in the work. Anyway, as I received the call from Dee, he says they had discussed it over with the family, and they wanted to know if I felt that I should come home, and I told him that I really would rather not, and because I was so busy trying to work with this new companion, and he was extremely discouraged in the work. We were in a very difficult area in the mission field. The people were not responding. We had no lessons, no contacts. We had nothing going for us. And I recall after the deciding to stay in the mission field, I felt very good about the decision, and so did Dee, and he said the rest of the family felt good about it. And I went into a room and spent a long time on my knees because I realized that I had seen my mother for the last time as she saw me off on the train in the mission field, and I needed the Lord's help to help Elder King. His name was Elder King, and we made a decision at that time, I did at that time, that I had to move out of the city and go into the country and do country tracting. It was the best decision that we ever made. Within 10 months of that prayer, we doubled that branch. We baptized approximately 30 or 40 people out in the country. That particular month, we broke all mission records, and those records still stand, and placing Book of Mormons and lessons, and it was just an excellent experience, and we felt that the Lord tried to compensate for the decision that was made. After returning from the mission field and talking to Dad, and by this time he had remarried Elmira, and talking to him and talking to Bill and reviewing some of the things, I convinced Bill and I to take me up to the area, and we wanted to see the crash site area. And at the same time, we thought, well, we'd go rabbit hunting. We both enjoyed jackrabbit hunting, and so he was going to go up and take me up there. And the more we talked, pretty soon some of the rest of the family wanted to go. If I remember correctly, Bernie wanted to go, and then pretty soon Barbara wanted to go, and then after a while, Dad wanted to go, and Elmira wanted to go, and Cleo. And I think they all just all got in a big car, and we packed a picnic lunch, and away we went. It's about 200 miles from Bountiful, I think it is. We correct that. Cleo and Bernie did not go, but my wife and I and Bill and Joyanne, and by this time I was married, my wife Talmadge. And Dad and Elmira and Barbara went up, and we packed a picnic lunch, and we took our guns, and away we went. And it was a long drive up there, and they drove up into the area, and the first place we wanted to go was to the Kunstler Ranch. And Bill wanted me to meet the Kunstlers. And so we went to went up and went to the ranch, and there we met Daryl and some of the Kunstlers, and they had the interesting part about this story is that they had a younger brother that just got back from a mission. His name was Jay. He's older? Oh, okay. And he was up on the haystack finishing up the work there, and came down, and of course he spied Barbara, and a romance started from that one particular trip, and Barbara, of course, will be forever grateful because that romance blossomed into, and now the Kunstlers are part of her family, and she's extremely grateful for the whole story. Anyway, we did some picnicking and visiting the area. We drove as far as we could up the mountainside there, and which wasn't very far, and went back home. One thing I forgot to say, this is still Bob. After I received the call, I became concerned. So the next morning, I called the mission home to inform the mission president. At that time was Henry A. Smith, of the accident and my mother's death, and of the decision that we had made. And the mission counselor who answered the phone indicated that President Smith was in Salt Lake for April conference and was unavailable, but he would be contacted. They would contact him and inform him of the accident. And they asked me if there was any others that they would like that I maybe could represent me at the funeral. And I says I would sure appreciate it if you'd contact Henry D. Moyle, who is a very close friend of mine that I became very close associated with President Moyle's son while I was attending the University of Utah, and in fact President Moyle spoke at my missionary farewell. But anyway, they were very gracious at the mission home and contacted both President Moyle and President Smith, and both those gentlemen represented me at the funeral, and I understand both of them spoke, or Henry D. Moyle spoke as part of the program. And President Smith it was very special when he came back, and at the next mission conference, the report that he gave of the Packard family and the funeral, and it was just very special to me.
Henry D. Moyle became president of the church, but
No, Henry D. Moyle was a counselor at the time, and he was a counselor to many of the present. Henry A. Smith was a relative of the other Smiths. He was the editor and the manager of the Deseret News most of the time.
Another thing, if this is D. Packard here, another thing that might be of interest, the Jeep posse in Bountiful, volunteered to go up and bring the plane out. We used a lumber company truck, Packard Lumber Company truck, to go up and get the plane, just a regular 1.5-ton flatbed truck. We were able to drive the truck right around to the plane. When I saw the plane then and looked it over, I marveled at how it had set down. There was no forward motion in the plane at all. It had stalled completely and just fell straight down. It was that direct downward drop that did the damage to all of our backs. This was true. It did save us. And the plane's wings just sort of folded down. They were not damaged. In fact, as we uncoupled the wings from the plane, saved them, the plane was rebuilt. The undercarriage, the landing wheels had collapsed from the force of the landing, and of course the prop was damaged. The plane was rebuilt, and as far as I know, it's still serviceable. But anyway, it was rather interesting as to how sometimes the Lord does guide in critical situations like this. But the plane was brought down by the Jeep posse. They did all of this free of charge to the family as part of a service project that they have. The plane landed on a plateau, or sort of a level spot. It was the only place that was available in that area, and it's right at the brow of the hill. Another 100 feet of altitude, I'd have gone on over and without hitting the hill at all. It was just 100 feet right from the top, and I've often thought, what made me come off the mountain the direction I did? If I'd have gone the other direction, never would have found help. It had gone towards Twin Falls in that direction. Later, since then, I've flown over the area. I've shown some of my family, Diane and such, the site as I've flown right directly over it and showed them. And we were right on the path, but we just got into weather that was not compatible to flying.
A couple of short observations. This is Bernie Packard. One was, we were a family of 7 immediately prior to the accident. Immediately after the accident, there was Cleo, myself, and Barbara essentially left. Ben was there, but he, within a matter of weeks, was in the university. And I also was in the university, so we went through the summer, myself, Barbara, and Cleo for a while. Then she went up to Beth's place. Dad was out of the hospital later on and lived with us in a small apartment. The home, which was brand new, built by Dee, had to be sold. And I've thought many times since then, we were a family of 7. Then the next day, the family was essentially disintegrated. Barbara and little Mark, I guess, suffered in a way the most because they were of still tender age. Benny and I were essentially on our own. I was 17 at the time. Now, the final point, in the hospital, we thought Mama was going to make it, and we didn't think Dad would, because his head was swollen up like a basketball. Eyes swollen shut, could hardly see his ears, jaws broken on all 4 sides, and wired shut. And he, of course, couldn't open his eyes. He was in a coma. I understand remained in a coma for many weeks, something like 7 or 8 weeks.
To set his back and set him in a big plaster.
I didn't know about that part. But the part that I do want to relate is that I wasn't there in the room when Mother died, and I don't know that anybody in our family was, maybe Beth, but in any event, were you, Bud? But shortly after Mama died, of course, we were all summoned, and we hastened into Daddy's room, and I Now maybe, I know many others observed this. I know I went in and saw. And Daddy, shortly after Mama died, I mean a matter of minutes and within 2 or 3 hours, was laying on his bed in a position such that his head was essentially butted up against the partition that divided his room from the room Mother was in, and her head had been up against the same partition. So they were essentially laid out head against head in a prone position. And Daddy, I watched him, and I'm certain others did too, bridge as a football player would bridge on the ball field in working out, such that he bent his neck and his head so that if he could open his eyes, he would be seeing right through that partition at his wife. And he did this and bridged up and watched and then collapsed back down, and then he bridged up again and looked, I presume looked through. I'm satisfied in my mind that he was 100% aware of what was going on, that he knew she passed away, and that he could see her spirit. The reason I'm convinced of this is because of the final part of this observation, and that was, shortly after that, he began in his unconscious state, which is unquestioned, documented by the physician that he was in a coma. He began to hum, if you can use this word, or grunt or groan, a tune that he used to sing to her as a love song, namely the Red River Valley, which is somewhat of a Texas song, with the Red River Valley and the Red River in Texas. Some could sing it, but it goes somewhat like, "From this valley they say you are going, I will miss your bright eyes and sweet smile." And he would hum this through, and it would take about 2 minutes. And we would be gathered around and watch and listen. And then he'd finish, and then he would do it again. And then he would do it again, and he did this for 2 or 3 or 4 hours. He would do it while we were there, and he would do it while we were not there. And I'm absolutely convinced, and I was then, as I watched and listened to him sing this tune to his to his wife, his beloved sweetheart, knowing that she had left this valley, at least for the time being, and that he won't get to see her sweet smile for some time.
Well, this is Floyd. The thing that Vaughn and I came up from California. We were down in the Navy at Camp Pendleton, and we came up as soon as we heard about it. I remember we all stayed down in that motel. We across the street from the hospital. We'd been up to see Mother and Daddy, and we felt so helpless. We went back down to the motel and we talked about it. All of us had held responsible positions in the church. We'd been faithful. We'd been called upon to administer to many people. Many times we had administered to people that we knew that the Lord would hear our blessing, and did, and made them well. And then as we met together to administer to Mom, to know that we just couldn't do it to the one that we loved the most. I just like to say that that was the most traumatic experience of my entire life. I loved my mother. More than anything else. That's possibly my wife. Took me several years before I could feel comfortable at all in anybody talking about my mother's leaving. But then as I look back over it and see the blessings that have derived from it, number one, Barbara met her husband. I don't think there's a better brother-in-law in the whole family than Jay Kunzler. They have 9 lovely children, all faithful and active. That all came about because of Mother's passing away. Jay totally turned his life around. He was in the process, but this was the culminating factor. And I've always felt that Mother, in fact, I don't feel it, I know that Mother would have gladly given her life without batting an eye to accomplish that one fact alone. Not only has Jay been active and faithful, but he is and has been a high priest in the church for a long time. He's raised 4 boys, all of them who've gone on missions. 3 of them are attorneys, and the 4th one has his PhD in teaching at the BYU. His wife joined the church and very active and faithful. You couldn't find a finer family than that family that I'm convinced Mother gave her life to get things in order. And then as you put the other things that will come out relative to some possible serious illnesses that were eventually going to take Mother's life anyway, to see where the Lord in His tender mercy would allow her in her last moments here on the earth to achieve such great things. It really does something to me. I've always said that if I could worship anybody here upon the earth, it'd be my mother.
I'm McLeod Packard, his family. I'm a member of this here family all these many years. So, I lived in Bountiful with my mother at the time, before this here accident, before it happened. I heard this dream about my father and my sweet loving mother. This dream just said to her, and I told all my brothers, listen to my father tell this dream. Some of my brothers laughed at him. I said, listen here, this is nothing that happened matter. This is true matter to me. I love my father and my mother dearly. They treat me so good and kind. Every time I bathe her breast, the smell is so strongly. She told me, Cleo, be careful with her. I said, I will, Mother. I've always been careful with her. After that, the pain to leave her, after that, I told one of my brothers, wish you call in and call to the doctors and tell her to get an appointment for her. And that she turned it down. And after that, the pain left her for a while and trying to leave her. Another dream I had is true to me. Warning, I have smell of smoke, and also I smell here a fire engine. I worked so hard with my mother in Boise, her dress shop there. And I always help her with all her things. I order them, sew them, all her hemming with her dress, formal dresses. And the fire broke out in the kitchen. Bob got trapped in her home there. And I told Bob do his best to squeeze through the telephone booth. Bob did his best to make his home, squeeze through. And that's what Mama said to me, Cleo, grab Mark. Mark is sick, he's not well. So I did. So we dragged him out. The house, that's what I had said to one of my brothers said, Cleo, get the fire hose and put the rod through the kitchen window. And I did. I ran the hose back to Bob. Bob said, the fire is out. We all stood on our hands and knees on the lawn.
This is Floyd again. I wasn't there, but prior to our arriving in Fremont, Beth Walker, our sister, had already arrived, and she said that when she went up to see Daddy, that he was, as has been mentioned, totally unconscious and was for over 2 months. But when she came into the room, she saw Daddy lying there unconscious, but with his right hand reaching up across his chest and slowly dragging it down across his chest, and he would continue to to do that, and she couldn't understand why he was doing that. Finally, she noticed that he didn't have on his temple garments, and she thought perchance that might be it. See, he had spent 5 years in the prisoner of war camp with the World War II as a prisoner of the Japanese. He had 2 pair of garments that he had patched and patched so that he could continue to wear the garments throughout the time that he was in the prisoner of war camp. He had felt that had preserved his life while he was there. And so she went and got permission to drape the garments over him. They couldn't put him on him. And so they draped the garments over his body, and he immediately discontinued rubbing his hand across his chest. He settled back in the state of coma that he actually was, calm and peaceful.
Okay, one last thing. This is Bud. When we were at the hospital just before Mother passed away, we were naturally all very concerned with the situation there because Dad was very bad, and Mother, of course, we were concerned for her. But it's important to note that, as was mentioned, that we all felt that Dad would die first, and that he would be the one that would pass away, and that probably Mother would be all right. Because Mother was very conscious. She had all her faculties. She would speak to us and even laugh and talk to us. There really wasn't that much concern over Mother, until all at once there was a turn for the worse. And I can remember that I was there at her bedside, and my sister Beth was there, and I believe Bernie was there, and maybe 1 or 2 other persons was there. But we learned that Mother was going to die, and Mother pulled me to her, and she says she must have had a great concern for us because, okay, Mother was concerned for me because she drew me to her. Okay, one last thing. This is Bud. At the time that Mother was in the hospital, just before her death, all of us were very concerned. It's important that we note that we all felt that Dad was going to die right away and that Mother would probably make it. We had been there and visited her several times. We were taking turns making our visits with her to see how she was. We were with Mother most of the time because she was coherent and conscious. She was easy to talk to. She could express herself. She would laugh with us occasionally. And we just felt that she was going to be all right, but when we saw our father and how bad he looked and his condition seemed to be deteriorating, we felt that he wouldn't last very long. Anyway, shortly after, Mother took a turn to the worst, and we knew that she was going to die. The doctors told us that she had pneumonia, that also the fatty tissues of her bones was circulating throughout her bloodstream, and that she was not expected to live very much longer at all. She became very poor very quickly, and
She was on a machine to support her. She began to deteriorate very fast. And anyway, myself and Beth and Cleo and I think one or two other persons was there. This was right at just as she was dying. She pulled me to her, and I'm convinced that our mother knew it. She loved the gospel with all her heart. She sure had a testimony, but she loved her children very much too. And she pulled me to her and she pleaded with me to move down to Utah. I was active in the church at the time, but she must have known that I had personal problems and weaknesses, and she must have sensed that I would become inactive, and she wanted me to have the support of my brothers. She wanted me to be with Dee and Jay and Bill, and she wanted me to live there with them and be among them so I'd have that extra strength. She knew of some of my personal problems, and she asked me if I would move down. And I don't remember what I said, but I can remember that had a great impact on my life because it wasn't long after that I did move down to Utah. And we lived there among Dee and Bill and Jay. But it was right after that that Mother was on this respirator machine, and her life was very, very short now. And I remember that the doctor told us that she wasn't going to make it and that it was just about over for her. And I can remember that Mother was complaining that she couldn't get enough air, that she couldn't breathe, that she was in pain, that she was having trouble, and she was struggling. And the doctor said that it's almost over. And I can remember that Mother said, "I have been a good girl." Then Beth pulled, at the direction of the doctor, she pulled a support plug for the machine, and Mother passed away right then. And I can remember we took her hand and clasped her hand, and I give her a hug. And then immediately Beth and I and Cleo went into the room where Dad was because we thought that he should have gone first. Now knowing that Mother had died, we felt that we wanted Dad to die too, because we knew that they loved each other and we wanted them to be together. And this was our feelings. So we went into Dad's room, and as Bernie explained earlier in the tape, that they were lying in prone position in separate hospital rooms with a partition. And there, as we walked in the room, there was Dad in an arc on his back, bridged up, with his head bent back, way back, and looking as if through the wall to where his wife was. And his eyes were wide open, but yet he was in a complete coma. He wasn't conscious of us being in the room. And I can remember Beth saying, "Dad, go with her." And there he was, in this arc condition with a broken back, but as yet his back was clear off the bed, and it looked as if the only part of his body that was touching was his buttocks and his head, that the rest was bridged up, and he was bent and looking through as if through the wall. And then he started to hum immediately this song, "The Red River Valley." And I don't remember whether he's having trouble with getting the song hummed and the tune going, but anyway, Beth started to prompt him a little bit. and she would prompt him, and then he would come on with the tune, and it was a very clear tune. He distinctly hummed very clearly all the way through the Red River Valley, and Beth would hum along with him.
Bud, if you know those words, could you say them or say them?
Everything I do.
You can ask me with Jay as you need.
Then after Dad had finished humming the song through, he slowly settled down, relaxed in his bed, and was as if he would remain in his coma, and was therefore in his coma for several more weeks. I believe it was 60 days. But it's interesting to note that I did have a great struggle for several years after that. I'd become inactive in the church. I'd lost my testimony. I'd become disinterested in the very principles that my mother had taught me. But through the tender mercies of our Heavenly Father, I've become active in the church again, and I'm all the way back. And since this has happened, and since my testimony has returned to me, and for the love of the gospel that I have, I've reflected many times on the principles and the good things that my parents taught me, because they're very choice and precious to me, and I am so thankful for the good things that they taught me and the example that they set for me. But I want to say now that I love the gospel with all my heart, that the gospel and my testimony is the most precious thing in my life. I know that my Redeemer lives, and I know that I will see him again, and that I will see my parents, and that we will enjoy eternal life together. I'm thankful for my brothers and sisters, for the good things that my parents have done for me through them. And I want to take this opportunity to express my love and appreciation to my parents and to my brothers and sisters, and I do this at this time.
There was a lady by the name of Sister Priest in the Bountiful, Utah, Valverde 2nd Ward, who was the Relief Society president at the time of the airplane crash, and my mother was her counselor. And Sister Priest told me this experience following the airplane crash. And she said on one occasion, she was telling me how she and Mom were visiting, and they were quilting in a living room, and they were sharing some of the experiences of their children. And Mom related the feelings that she had about her son, Jay, and the concern that she had about his life. And Brother and Sister Priest went on a trip to California with Mom and Dad just prior to the airplane crash. And they went to visit Jay and Florence, his wife, and their 4 boys. And when Mom returned, they were in this living room quilting. And Mom says to Sister Priest, "I have done everything that I possibly could do in this life to influence my son to embrace the gospel." And she said, "I would be willing to do anything else if I only knew what it was, even give my own life if it was required." And then I recall Sister Priest saying to me, "That is exactly what your mother has done. She has sacrificed her life for her son."